Hi there, welcome to part 1024 on the Trojan Knight opening. In this video we're going to be looking at probably the main line of the whole 2e3 variation, and that's, after these moves, the move d4 for white. Before we get onto that, I'm quickly going to mention a possibility that was suggested in response to my last video on the Queen h5 variation. This was a suggestion that was made by a very strong atomic player who goes by the nickname Yukimix on Free Chess and on Buho21, and that idea is knight takes g6. Now this aims to really weaken black's light squares, the immediate threat being queen h5 check. If black responds in the most direct fashion with h5, then queen g3 opens up this dual threat of queen g6 and queen d6, which can't be adequately met. Therefore knight e7 is the only move that black can play. Now white has a few options here. The move that Yukimix mentioned was queen h5, but I think after knight g6 it's quite hard to see how white can really get an attack going. Bishop d3 doesn't do much, because this bishop takes g6 can never happen with the queen on h5, as it will be caught in the crossfires. Knight c3 I suppose is a possibility, developing a piece. Can be answered by bishop b4. Black seems to be getting decent game. Probably the most natural move is d4, aiming to follow up with e4, putting pressure on d5. But I think black has a very nice response here. It's worth probably playing bishop b4, and then the move I like, f5. So this opens up the queen coming to h4, and also keeps e4 well under control. And I think black's doing very well. Other possibilities for white would be, for example, queen g3, e5, stopping this queen from coming out to d6. And now it seems that black's got everything covered, but white's idea is to play queen g7, sacrificing the queen and aiming to blast open down the g file with g4, followed by g5 and rook g1. But I don't think it's too strong here. In some openings this idea of sacrificing the queen and opening a file for a rook are actually very strong, but in this case I think black has too much counterplay in the centre with d4, and in the worst case he's going to be able to block the g file, and I'd much rather be black. So probably the most challenging move is knight c3. Bishop b3 straight away is also possible and will probably transpose after knight g6. But knight c3, knight g6. Now queen h5 will transpose to the queen h5 check line we looked at just now. But after bishop d3, for natural bishop b4. So in all cases black's really playing knight e7, knight g6 and then bishop b4. And it gives him quite a good game. Probably the only real way that white can try to take advantage of this is to play bishop takes g6. Sort of taking away the defender from the light squares and reopening the threat of queen h5. I don't think there's any problem with rook g8 here, but the move h5 I think is actually very, very strong for black. Now it might seem at first glance that queen g3 is a strong move, so this is threatening to infiltrate down the g file with queen g6 or queen g7, and also play queen takes c7. But black has this move, knight e5. So this is blocking this diagonal and also covering g6. If white continues with queen g7, knight d3 is quite a rude awakening and black wins immediately. In fact here black's already completely won, as if white takes time to defend against his knight d3 check threat, knight g4 will come in instead, or knight f3, winning the queen in both cases. So queen g3 is impossible, but without that move it's hard to see what white can do, because e5 will come next and this queen is really badly placed on h4, and black's going to take advantage of it with moves like bishop h3 or rook g8, or maybe bishop g4, and also knight d4 is kind of come in, taking advantage of this pin on this diagonal. If white tried to get out by castling, well, it's pretty much a suicide move castling here, because if you open g file black's going to quickly mate white. So knight takes g6 is quite a tricky move, but if black knows what he's doing, I think he'll come away with better chances. And therefore I'd still keep my same judgment that I had in my last video, that I would never play this queen h5 to queen h4 manoeuvre, because I think it really gives black very good counter-attacking chances against these awkward pieces. So d4, the most common move in this position. Now black's most common response here is to play knight f6, and this has a seal of approval from one of the strongest players in the world, Onyu Benze. But I'm not completely convinced by it. I think that after f3, I have mentioned this before in the history videos, this whole line, I think gives white some advantage. So black quickly develops, knight takes d5, c6. I'm not going to go into too much analysis here. I mean, white has lots of options, maybe h4, stopping any future queen h4 check, or d5 is perhaps more ambitious. Black's always going to have counterplay because he has better development and quite naturally developed pieces. But objectively, I think white should have the better chances if he can defend accurately. So I'm going to go for the move a6. Feel free to disagree with me and play this way if you like, but I'm going to focus on this move a6, which I think is a better move. The most natural move here for white is to play knight takes d5. A takes b5, this is the point of a6, to be able to respond to knight takes d5 with a takes b5, rather than having to play c6. Now, black's opened up a threat on a2. a4 is possible, a mistake though, as now black gets a lot of very good play, in one of two ways. Bishop b4 is a good move. This really weakens these light squares. Black can bring the queen out. And black's probably winning here actually, because if white tries to swap the queens off with this typical response, knight f6, now a queen swap can be answered by knight g4 or knight e4, and black's doing very, very well. Another simple strong idea is knight f6. It's been played by some strong players, including Francisco. After f3, knight d5, with this common dual threat of queen h4 and knight b4. Unfortunately, white does have a better move than a4, and that's queen h5. The idea behind this is simply to bring the queen over to b6, and this hook manoeuvre we see often in lots of the openings. In this case, however, it's simply to swap the queens off, and now play a4. So white's avoided all those nasty tricks that black had last time. However, I do feel that black does have some decent play here, and we'll be looking at similar positions to this later on. It's quite a common situation, and I have mentioned it in the final tactics video, in that black often has dynamic compensation with the two bishops. So white is a slight material ahead with two pawns for a bishop. But after e5, black has very natural development. He'll bring his pieces out to good squares, and it's quite hard really, actually it's quite difficult to play for white. Objectively it's probably black that has to be a little bit more accurate, but I think he does get some play. I'm not going to analyse it too much here because white has so many different options, it's impossible to cover them all from a theoretical perspective, but we will be coming back to similar positions later on and looking at the kind of ideas that can occur. Apart from knight takes d5, white has a lot of other options, almost all of which are going to be answered by e5. The move queen h5 will transpose to lines we considered in the previous video, after queen h4 and f6. So see the last video for that. Another option, say h4. If you're not sure how we're going to answer to this move, then you probably haven't seen the other videos. It's always the same, always e5. And now if knight h5, bishop g4. And white has a choice to either play f3 with an equal position or queen f3. with an unclear one. Perhaps a little bit more tricky in this case after f3 for black, because after swapping this off, it's not obvious that it's completely equal because white has this annoying move e4, putting pressure on d5. I think black has to be quite careful here, but after the sequence e takes d4, it's a good move. e5, trying to ram this pawn into black's face. I think black has a very nice response. Bishop b4 check and king f8, unpinning this knight. So now knight d4 is the immediate threat. Well, if white continues trying to press home with e6 and queen e2, black has this move, knight e5. So it's another reason for this knight to be unpinned, and black's doing well. So white will have to come up with something else. Knight takes d5 is also possible. In this case, after a takes b5, black's getting a lot of counterplay again. So again, white has some material advantage. Say a4, but now knight f6, taking advantage of this pin along with d5. So d takes c5 can't be played, and threatening to jump in with the knight. If white stops that, black simply does it anyway. And after this pretty much full sequence, black is only a pawn down here, but he has a lot of compensation. This white square bishop is unopposed, and it's just going to stick in middle of white's camp and provide a lot of counterplay. I won't go through all the other moves like g3 and c3 and knight a3. They'll all be answered by e5 with exactly the same ideas, that if knight h5 then bishop g4, and if knight takes d5 then a takes b5. So we'll look at this move next, knight c3. Actually, hang on, before I go to knight c3, which will take us to main line, I will simply mention this move as well, bishop a4. This is quite an interesting idea in that it's taking away, it's moving the bishop away from the capture on b5. So now knight takes d5 is more of a threat. Here I like the move knight f6. Now I wasn't too keen on this move on the previous move, but now black in a lot of lines has the extra resource of bishop a3 because of his bishop's placement on a4. So for example f3, bishop a3, or perhaps bishop b4 check and then bishop a3. But in both cases I think black's doing perfectly okay. Knight takes d5, one possible option, b5. And now in response after f3, defending against this knight, bishop e3. And if white takes that off with the pawn, knight d5 with this dual threat, it's very strong for black. Knight takes e6 also can be answered with a nice tactic, bishop g4. And then this bishop, after being blocked here, can come back to f5, hitting c2 and also threatening queen h4. So bishop a4 isn't too much to worry about. Knight c3 though, this is probably the most critical line, and here black has to be careful. Knight f6 I think gets him into a lot of trouble after f3. It's quite hard to find a good move for black here. This knight c3 move means that white's often threatening knight g6 as well in a lot of lines, because bishop b4 check is taken out of the equation. I'll also mention that bishop b4 here is a bad move, because after knight takes d5, black wants to take this bishop, but now he's put his own bishop in the firing line. So black's in a lot of trouble there. But e5, the move that black always wants to play, so if we can get away with it, why not? First of all, we look at the critical captures on d5. So knight takes d5, knight f takes d5, a takes b5. Now, white has a few options, so we'll quickly go through them. h4, stopping the queen h4 check idea, gives black very good counterplay after knight f6. Similar to a line we saw before. After f3, stopping this knight from jumping in. Knight e4 can get black into a bit of trouble, because it's a little bit different to a line we looked at a second ago, in that after this knight on b5 is actually coming in. Maybe possible, but I think bishop b4 is a better option. Now a3, just avoiding the capture on a2. Now knight e4. So now we've taken out this option of knight b5. We're coming straight back in with this idea. And black was getting very good counterplay. White could try knight b5 as well. This is a possibility. But again, black's going to be getting lots of play with knight e4. Say f3, knight f2, followed by bishop b4 and c6. And both sides are going to have a monster knight. Unclear chances of both sides. f4 again is going to be really weaken these light squares. Now the bishop comes to g4 with good play. So h4 aims at really containing black's play, but it doesn't really work because of this knight f6 move. Other options, knight b5, quite a natural option. But now black takes advantage of the fact that white hasn't stopped this and plays queen h4. And swapping the queens off. And bishop h3. So now white has this quite good knight, which can somehow perhaps get into black's position, but this knight really compensates for it. a4, avoiding rook takes a2, which will simply win a pawn. Check, and e takes d5. And we have another one of these cases where black has good counterplay. It's going to be hard for white to really organise castling. Knight f6 is going to come, followed by castle's kingside, and centralising the rooks. And these two bishops are really going to annoy white. So good, decent compensation for black there. Knight d5 is a possibility. But again, white's going to follow up in this same fashion. Sorry, black's going to follow up in the same fashion. But the knight on d5 is a lot more loose, because if white now swaps the queens off, e takes d4 is going to follow. Therefore, white has to be a little bit more careful. Knight f6 check is a necessary move, and it's probably a worse version of the line we looked at just now, in that white doesn't even have this strong knight on b5, and therefore black is getting a lot of good play here, threatening simply to open up the d file and really trap white's king. d5 avoids this by stopping e takes d4, but then c6, and again the d file is being opened up, and it's quite hard to see how white's going to avoid getting mated. So white has a very important finesse here, which gives some improvements over those lines, and that's queen h5, and now knight b5. Now, if you think for a minute, you can see why this is such a good idea. Immediately, white is threatening to take on c7, winning material, so black is basically forced to go out to h4 with the queen. But now, rather than g3, which will probably transpose to the previous lines, white can now simply swap the queens off, and he's avoided making this really weakening g3 move, allowing bishop h3. So now black has to come up with something different. It would be nice if his pawn was on g3, but black can still get some play with bishop g4. Threatening to come in here with the bishop, so white puts a stop to that. f3, and now grabbing this pawn on a2. Now f takes g4. Material's actually level now. So if black's not in any real danger, you can say that he survived the opening with a playable position. I think e4, and it's hard to see. I mean, a future knight, this knight wants to somehow wiggle its way into position, but a future knight a7 can be answered by knight e7, and I don't see that black really has any major problems. I think black's doing okay here. So knight f takes d5, probably one of the most challenging moves, and black's doing perfectly okay. Knight c takes d5, takes. Now knight d5 will transpose to a line we looked at just now, in that was quite good for black after queen h4, but now knight h5 is a possibility as well. Bishop g4 is a standard response, but it is a possibility here. Probably doing okay after taking here. But queen h4 is also possible with an unclear game. So that knight capture on d5 is also perfectly okay for black. Some more, perhaps more interesting options for white, what we'll look at now, are knight of his knight moves, knight to e6 and knight to g6, and knight to h5 immediately. So again, knight h5, bishop g4, or queen h4, both cases interesting play. Knight g6. Now the reasoning behind this move is if f takes g6, queen f3, and this pressure on the e5 pawn stops black from naturally blocking this queen, and therefore white's doing very well. Bishop b4 is pretty much the forced move. So now black has had a sort of re-threatened white with e takes d4, which will win a piece and check white. So knight takes h8 is probably the move we want to look at first, but it falls for another different tactic. Bishop g4 and bishop f5, threatening c2 and h4. So what other tries can white do? Perhaps h4, stopping this, all these tactics over here. E takes d4 as I mentioned, very strong. Now simply taking the knight. Black's lots of material ahead. D takes e5, just avoiding that trick. Now I suppose bishop g4 is possible, just blocking this queen in, then taking on g6 seems perfectly okay. But also d4 is going to give black very good counterplay. I think the most challenging move for black to face is queen f3. Now this is actually very dangerous, because black's forced to advance the f pawn when this knight is no longer on pre, and it can just be a constant nuisance. I think f5 is the best move. f6 is I originally thought this was possible, but I think after d takes e5, it's actually very dangerous for black. If d4, then this queen's coming into d5 now, so that's not possible. And bishop f5, queen f4, coming into d6. And if you take this check, simply king d1, and white's winning. So that's some nasty tactics there, going in white's favour. So f5. And I had a game from this position as black against a very strong computer program called Sordid on free chess, and that game continued knight e7, So you're threatening the c8 bishop, taking here check. There's lots of tactics here. An important resource now is knight f6, threatening to win the queen. So after taking this queen, knight g4, queen takes f5, getting an extra pawn for the getting extra pawn for the queen. And now I've got some good play with castles. Bishop a3. Another tactic for black to really getting his knight into a good position. So here we take a little bit of stock. I mean, white is a piece up, but black's getting very good play and coming into threatening to take on a2 and threatening knight c2 check. So after knight c2 check, black can take on a1 here, but I chose the more ambitious move, a takes b5. And black has really good compensation. Only a pawn down, and white's king's in the middle. So follow up with d4, which is a move I tried, or rook fd8 might be an improvement. Either way, black's doing very well. So a long complicated line there, but essentially black's getting good counterplay, and this is when white is playing really accurate moves. There's just as many pitfalls for white to avoid as there are for black in these types of variations. So knight e6 was the other possibility. Again, f takes e6, bad move. Queen f3, the same as with knight g6. So black has to come up with something else. The only other option is bishop takes e6, so we have to play that one. Now, knight takes d5 is possible. A takes b5. Now a4 is a mistake, avoiding the capture on a2. Black will follow up with the standard dual threat trick after f3 knight d5. So white really has to play queen h5 and put this queen here like this. And as is usually the case, black will get very good compensation playing against this queen, giving him very good counterplay. Queen h5 immediately is pretty much the same story, but it's quite hard to see what else white can do apart from this knight takes d5 and queen h5. So again, here, knight d5 I suppose will transpose, and otherwise black will get counterplay with moves like h5 and g5, or h5 and knight h6. So I think that's pretty much it. Probably the most critical variations are going to be these ones with knight f takes d5, and then this really nice nice move, queen h5, avoiding the weakening of the light squares around the king side, followed by knight b5. So we'll just recap this line. This is the one I think that if something does come up for white, it's going to be in this type of position. But from looking at it now, I think black has enough after these moves. e4 and materials level, and all white's threats are really quite easily answerable. So castles f5. This is going to be fine for black. Okay, thanks for watching. In the next video we're going to be looking at the alternative to d4, and that's d3. So quickly show you that one. I think this has a few differences, and that in a lot of the lines we looked at in these videos you saw the weaknesses that white had on the e4 and g4 squares, and d3 is perhaps a little bit more tricky. It looks less ambitious than d4, but I think it asks black a few more questions. So if you come back, we'll be doing that in the next video. So thanks for watching.